You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, trust is in short supply. The UN Secretary-General calls on global powers to come together on climate change as leaders gather in Rome. From Rome to Tel Aviv and London, thousands gather across the world to call for meaningful action. And the architect of the 2015 Paris Agreement with a warning on the eve of the Glasgow conference.
Science has been screaming from the rooftops and telling us that we are totally running out of time, that we're staring at the precipice.
Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with solutions. Now, leaders of the world's wealthiest countries are gathering in Rome ahead of this weekend's G20 meeting. They face the huge twin challenges of COVID-19 and how to revive the global economy. But the world's gaze will soon turn to Glasgow and COP26, so all eyes are on what global leaders might agree on climate action. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, had a warning for those leaders when he spoke this afternoon.
There is a serious risk that Glasgow will not deliver. Several recent climate announcements might leave the impression of a rosier picture. Unfortunately, this is an illusion. And today, trust is in short supply. There are serious questions of credibility. We see dangerous levels of mistrust among the big powers, among members of the G20, between developed and developing countries, including emerging economies. And so the most important objective of this G20 summit must be to re-establish trust.
Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, is in Rome.
There are thousands of protesters preparing to converge on Rome tomorrow for the G20 summit from climate camps like this one. And their message to world leaders will simply be it's not good enough what they're hearing from them in terms of tackling climate change. Some people are saying that the whole system needs to change. Others saying there just needs to be more effort and more momentum by world leaders. I think worrying them, but also a lot of observers of this summit and also which is seen as a prelude to the COP26 summit is the fact that countries like China, India, Mexico, Russia are pulling back from what had seemed like commitments they were moving towards on phasing out coal, but also it seems sort of foot dragging over the effort to reduce emissions to keep global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now, the Americans are arriving here without a deal sealed in Congress over particularly climate change commitments, spending commitments on that. Joe Biden hasn't got that deal, so there is a sense, I think, that allies don't feel that confident that he's going to be able to deliver, and if he can't, then other richer nations gathering here in Rome won't be that committed to it either, and that is a pretty bad start ahead of COP26 beginning next week in Glasgow.
And as leaders arrive in Glasgow from around the world, we'll have special coverage of the COP26 UN Climate Summit from 5 p.m. on Sunday night here on Sky News. And for uninterrupted coverage of the summit, including special guests and analysis, you can watch Sky News Climate Live on channel 525 from 10 a.m. on Monday. Now, the G20 leaders will move from Rome to Glasgow on Sunday. And while they are the people who have the power to enforce action on climate, it's arguably the global protest movement that's done the most to change the debate in recent years. Well, today, thousands have gathered across the world in Rome, as we heard from Dominic, and from Tel Aviv to Glasgow to London, where Greta Thunberg joined the crowds, demanding the leaders move faster towards climate goals. Our correspondent, Ali Fortescue, reports.
Well, there are climate protests happening around the world today, and here in London the focus has been on the City of London, on the financial institutions, on investment in fossil fuels. The protesters started over at Lloyd's. They made their way through the City of London here to Standard Chartered Bank, and that was a moment when this protest got really charged because Greta Thunberg arrived, which was obviously a highly significant moment, something that the activists were very excited about. She, of course, has become the voice of the youth climate change movement, and unsurprisingly, unsurprisingly, the world's media descended on her. I have to say the atmosphere was quite intense, very charged as she walked down the street to come and meet her fellow activists. She didn't stay for very long. She didn't really speak. She didn't say very much, but she is going to be in Glasgow at the end of next week for another protest because, of course, we are edging ever closer to COP26 in Glasgow, and people came here for all these protests from far and wide, I think with a particular urgency because we are so close to COP26. I spoke to someone who came here from Tonga who said that he's here because the place where he lives, the beautiful island as he put it, is on the front line of the climate change problem. He hopes by raising his voice here in London today and in Glasgow next week, people will start to listen. And as I say, this is one of at least 25 different countries where young people and people of all ages really have come out on the streets en masse to protest ahead of the COP26 summit.
Well, in some of today's other climate news, China's President Xi Jinping will not be flying to Glasgow for the COP26 climate summit. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said he will talk to global leaders by video link instead. It comes after China formally submitted its climate goals, pledging to reach peak carbon emissions before 2030. Multiple flood warnings remain in place in parts of Scotland and the northwest of England. The Met Office has calculated that 379.4 millimetres of rain fell over the 48 hours between Wednesday and Thursday. That's close to the UK two-day record of 405 millimetres. Scientists have warned these events will become more frequent and more intense without significant cuts to carbon emissions. And a German artist has, yes, rolled his way into Glasgow in a giant metal ball just in time for COP26. Arndt Drossel has spent the last 3 months walking more than 900 miles from his hometown of Paderborn, passing through 7 countries to get to the UN climate conference. Arndt says he hopes to inspire people to make one promise: to protect the environment. So all the climate action we're talking about and the central aim of the summit in Glasgow is to slow the pace of this temperature rise. While carbon dioxide emissions continue to rise, that will be impossible. But if the world does manage to make the transition from fossil fuels, reducing coal and gas to zero will be crucial. And you can see here that Great Britain is currently using no coal in its electricity supply. However, coal plays a huge role in Poland's energy mix, and it makes up about 3/4 of its electricity generation. But one mine has been accused of draining water supplies on the Poland-Czech border and has been ordered to close by the European Court of Justice. Well, despite the ruling, the mine has stayed open, and Poland's government has just extended the licence for it to operate until 2044. Our correspondent Stephen Murphy reports now from Poland.
Poland loves its coal. The fossil fuel generates around 3/4 of the country's electricity, and there's a large and powerful coal lobby. It's dirty, it's damaging, and it's divisive. As we'll see at COP26, richer nations want coal gone. Other countries think the transition is too fast. There's a lot of opposition here to the EU's Green Deal, which aims for climate neutrality by 2050. We went to one coal mine at Turów to see how the Poles are fighting to exploit their own resources. The Turów mine is the second largest open cast coal mine in Poland, and to get a true sense of its scale you really need to take to the air. It stretches for more than 2,500 football pitches, and the Polish government has now extended its licence to operate until 2044. The Polish are determined to use those extra years to take every bit of coal out of the ground here.
Gdyby tylko oprzeć się na węglu brunatnym, Polska mogłaby funkcjonować bez energii odnawialnej jeszcze przez jakieś 150 lat. Proszę pana, podstawową sprawą jest to, co wylatuje z komina, a nie to, co się wrzuca do oczywiście pieca. Więc proszę pana, jeżeli spełnia się normatywy, a elektrownia Turów i elektrownia Bełchatów spełniają wytyczne konkluzji batowskich w kontekście emisji różnych substancji.
It's not just about feeding the power station here that produces 7% of Poland's electricity. It's also about the thousands of jobs the mine supports. In the nearby town of Bogatynia, people shudder to think of a future without coal money.
Najprawdopodobniej tak, bo tutaj by straciło przykładowo pracowników w kopalni tam 3000, 4000 jest, nie powiem dokładnie, w elektrowni 2000.
As Turov's reserves are exploited, the mine will creep closer and closer to the Czech border. In the Czech village of Uhelna, residents claim the encroaching mine is draining their water.
But the crucial area for us is here, and this will be mined in 5 years.
Milan Staric says the water issue started around the same time the mine first expanded towards the border.
So this is the well,
This is the old well.
or what used to be the well.
It is still a well, but it's completely empty right now.
Pressure from these residents led to the Czech government taking Poland to the European Court of Justice. The court ordered the mine to shut down. The Poles refused. They're now being fined €500,000 a day by the court, but say the fines won't be paid. Moving away from fossil fuels is painful, and in Turov's case, can drive a wedge between nations.
Christiana Figueres is a Costa Rican diplomat who shot to global fame during COP21 in Paris 6 years ago. Now, she's credited with forcing international leaders to come together and sign a deal that broke new ground in the fight against climate change. On the eve of Glasgow, she spoke to our science and technology editor Tom Clark about why 1.5 degrees is key to climate progress.
We know that a world that goes to 2 degrees with respect to a world that stays at 1.5, we will have 2 to 3 times as much infrastructure destruction, 2 to 3 times as much biodiversity loss, and perhaps most importantly, 2 to 3 times as much human misery, pain, and poverty. That is a situation that we cannot tolerate. That is why 1.5 is now cemented in everyone's heart, brain, and soul as being the top ceiling of what we can tolerate as a temperature increase. Science has been screaming from the rooftops and telling us that we are totally running out of time, that we're staring at the precipice. But science has also been very clear to say that if we get to half emissions by 2030, that we can actually be able to open up a door that takes us to 1.5 as maximum temperature rise. So technically, it is entirely possible. Financially, entirely possible.
What keeps you awake at night in terms of things that could go wrong at COP?
What keeps me awake at night is the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, period. Because I know what that means for my children and your children and all those who are coming. The COP, everything could go wrong and everything can actually come together again.
Let's get straight to discussing the climate issues of the day with a climate justice activist, Daze, Aghaji, and Sam Hall, the director of the Conservative Environment Network. There they are. Hello to you both. So a whole new generation have become involved in calling for action to tackle the climate crisis. Young people will be the most affected by global warming and are demanding change. We've seen them protesting today. But how important is the role of the youth movement in tackling climate change? Daze, let's start with you. What do you think?
Well, I think it's fundamental. I think we are the generation that will be facing climate change. And not only are we the generation that will face it, but we are the generation who have the vision and the inspiration to continue to fight it. There is something about young people, and not even young people my age, but young people like children. They have a really amazing way of seeing the world in a way that seems quite black and white. Like, for example, I used to teach in a primary school, and I told them about fossil fuels, and they went, Daze, that doesn't make any sense. And I went, what do you mean it doesn't make any sense? Then they said, no, that whole process doesn't make any sense. Why would we be doing that to our earth? And I went, good point. It doesn't make any sense. So it just shows like the clarity in understanding that young people have around how our system is toxic and it shouldn't be this way. But then also going into how we have the hearts and minds to openly vision about the world we should have and the world that we do deserve. And I think that's what you're seeing on the streets today.
Sam, what do you think? Do you think they're any different from the likes of Insulate Britain, for example?
I do think they are different, actually, and I think the youth movement does play a really vital role, and particularly as Dave said, because ultimately those of us who currently work in politics and are working on climate policy, we have a profound responsibility to future generations to hand on a planet that's in a healthy and safe condition for those future generations. So it is for the benefit of young people predominantly that we're doing this. I also think there's economic opportunities for young people if we can develop the clean technologies and the green industries that we'll need to reach net zero from all the green jobs that we'll be creating across the country. Some recent research came out this week actually showing that there's a pay premium for green jobs, which I thought was really striking. But yes, I think to your question about whether they're different from, say, Insulate Britain, I think they are different. I think the tactics that they use are much less disruptive, much less counterproductive. I think they are focusing much more on highlighting what the science says and making the moral case that this current generation has to step up and tackle this challenge, rather than, as I say, these disruptive protests that I think alienate a lot of kind of middle ground voters in particular.
But Daze, if you look at what's happening in Rome today, the G20 leaders are there. They're going to come up with some sort of agreement, we hope, about climate action going into Glasgow. But the youth movement, they don't have a seat at the table there.
Yeah, I think the idea of having a seat at the table is something that we all need to discuss, because young people don't have a seat at the table. Vulnerable frontline communities don't have a seat at the table, which tends to be ethnic minority people and people from working class backgrounds. And in this COP, sadly, because of COVID and vaccine apartheid, we're seeing less people have their deserved seat at this table. Where are the Indigenous groups? Where are the delegates? Why aren't we making decisions, not just as governments, but as communities, as a civil society? And the interaction between civil society and COP has been sparse so far. So there is that kind of question of not just young people, why don't we have a seat at the table? But entirely, why do people who sit on the margins of society don't have a seat on the table when we are the first to be hit by climate change?
Sam, what do you think? Do you think COP26 is going to be different this time around? It's going to be more representative?
I think it will do. I mean, obviously, it's incredibly difficult because of COVID to get lots of people to Glasgow. There are going to be limits on the number of people able to attend some of the blue zone events inside the kind of formal UN space each day, because we don't want to see a massive spike in COVID cases. Similarly, I think there are obviously issues as well with people travelling and having to undergo quarantine restrictions, and also accessing what is a very busy hotel and an Airbnb market in Glasgow, which I think is proving very challenging. But I think the government has done everything it can do realistically within the space of in the constraints of COVID. It's made vaccines available for delegations coming from overseas. It's made some of the travel restrictions a bit easier to manage for some of those delegations. So I think given the difficult circumstances, it is as open as possible. I think there'll be a strong civil society voice there at COP to make sure that world leaders understand and hear some of these different perspectives as they hopefully come to an agreement in a couple of weeks' time.
Well, let's hope. Let's leave the youth movement and representation and move now to art, because as we saw earlier, an artist has rolled his way to Glasgow with the hope of encouraging people to protect the environment. But can art really inspire change? Daze, what did you think? Did you see him in his metal ball?
Yes, and I absolutely loved it. And weirdly enough, that's not the only really important installation that's happening at COP. There are many, like, for example, the air pollution pods, which have taken air pollution from many different parts of the world and have created like an installation that people can basically go into feeling, what it's like to be in London versus what's like to be in Sweden, and feel the difference within our air quality. So I think that's particularly important to bring art. And also, as an artist myself, I work at a local nature reserve as an artist in residence, and going through and seeing how people can connect back to the climate and our Mother Earth, and this being the sphere for their action that they take on climate change is truly important. I also work within theatre, and I'm currently working on a production with Boundless Theatre, talking about how can we save the planet when we are broke and we are young. And there's something that's quite amazing about this, because it connects the idea of climate and the issues on climate right round to the social issues that we face within society, that's aimed towards bringing community into action with understanding where they sit within the solutions to climate change. Art is a very powerful tool, and we should not mistake it as not.
Sam, what do you think? Do you think art can raise awareness and, in turn, impact policy?
I think art can raise awareness. I think it often, through some, very vivid imagery can cut through to audiences that maybe political messages or a speech from a politician sometimes can't. So I think it can really, bring to life some of the threats and some of the challenges we face from environmental degradation. I mean, I recently, to give an example, went to see the Wildlife Photographer of the Year exhibition, and there saw some really haunting imagery of what we're doing in terms of habitat degradation and destruction. So I think it can be really powerful for highlighting some of the challenges. But I do think that, ultimately the challenge of solving these problems, we need to channel that concern, which I think does exist at quite a high level already among the public around issues like climate change and habitat loss, into specific policies, which ultimately will help us deal with the challenge. And I think they're, engaging people with some of the potential solutions, some of the technologies that we're going to have to adopt and what that might mean for their lives, as well as incentivizing them financially to take up some of those technologies and shift their behavior. I think that's a really key part of getting the policy response right. But I think art can play an important role right at the start in getting people engaged and interested and aware of some of the challenges.
And just briefly, Daze, do you think that art is somewhere where the youth can actually come and interact with climate change?
Definitely. And I think that we should start expanding what we call art, because art isn't just, the physical visual painting, but it's the writing, it's the poetry, it's the songs, it's the protests. And I always say, protests are one big production. There is visually beautiful things that happen at protests. And I think even today, with the making of signs and people expressing their grief, their fears, but also their joy and their love of the planet through different means, I think that's something that young people are doing very well.
Okay, fantastic. Well, an exciting week ahead of us. Daze, Sam, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Don't forget to listen to this week's Climate Cast. On this week's episode, our climate, political and science correspondents discuss why a lack of finance for developing nations and a reliance on coal could jeopardise success at COP26. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. See you next time.